Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming tonight. I see we have a wonderful turnout. I'm really pleased to see it. Welcome to people who I've seen before, many faces, people who come routinely, and to many new people who are here maybe for the first time tonight. And in particular, I really welcome all of the people who've come from the St. Augustine Gators Club, and I hope you had a pleasant evening here, and I really hope that we see you again for some evenings at Whitney. And so tonight is another in our lectures of the Evenings at Whitney, which we hold approximately once a month, usually but not quite always, at Thursdays at 6 p.m. And this is a lecture series where resident faculty at Whitney, we have 5 resident faculty here. Whitney is a University of Florida Research Institute. Our faculty of scientists, renowned scientists that they know, who they think will be great public speakers, and they invite them here to give a lecture to the general public and to meet with our faculty and students and have a really wonderfully sort of invigorating discussion with these scientists that we invite. And our speaker tonight, I'm really happy and delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Nancy Knowlton, who's the Sant Chair Emerita of the Smithsonian Natural Museum of Natural History. And she was actually here yesterday giving a talk as part of an Endowed Whitney lecture series at Gainesville. And so we've got her back for a second talk, and we're delighted to have her again. So Dr. Knowlton is one of the most sort of respected marine scientists, and her work has sort of fundamentally changed how we understand coral reefs, biodiversities, and threats to our ocean. She began her academic training at Harvard. She got a PhD from UC Berkeley, and over her career, she's had faculty positions at Yale, at UCSD Scripps, Institute of Oceanography, and there she founded a Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, which really was a multidisciplinary hub, bringing in different kinds of scientists, social scientists, to think about approaches for understanding and protecting our planet, and you'll see some of that in her talk tonight. Her research, her work has really revealed hidden levels of genetic diversity on coral reefs, transformed how we think about species, boundaries, reef resilience, and response to climate change. She co-led the coral reef efforts of the Census of Marine Labs, a global collaboration that dramatically expanded what we understood about ocean biodiversity. And her work has been recognized by some of the highest honors that can go to scientists. She's a member of the National Academy of Science, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, recipients of the Heinz Award with a special focus on the environment, and the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award for her contributions to research, but also to communication and education, which you'll see very much highlighted in her talk today. She's authored a National Geographic book, Citizens of the Sea, which celebrates the discoveries of the Census of Marine Life, and she helped launch the #Ocean Optimism and Earth Optimism movements, and you'll see this very much highlighted in the topic of her talk to this evening, where she really looked at the bright spots and the success stories of conservation. So today, this will be her talk, Conservation Bright Spots, Making a Difference for Nature, Climate, and People. And with that, please welcome Dr. Nancy Knowlton.
So is my mic on? Yes, I can hear it. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see you all on this somewhat breezy evening, but I guess it's a little warmer. I come from Maine, so this is very warm for me, but I guess last week you had weather that was more like Maine than Florida typically is, so I'm glad it warmed up a bit so I could have a respite from the 5-degree temperatures I've been living with and the ice and snow. It's really lovely to be able to see birds flying around and palm trees and relax in the really beautiful weather you have here. I've been here since I got here, I got to the university on Tuesday, and I've had some amazing conversations there, and now spent the day here, and I've already learned so much. It's one of the reasons I really like coming and giving talks, is because it's an opportunity for me to hear what's going on in different places and learn so much about the exciting research being done, both at the main campus in Gainesville and here. I even got to see some baby worms tonight, this afternoon, swimming around. They were really beautiful. and had some wonderful conversations about the ocean and the planet at large. So as you can see, my talk is about conservation bright spots. I think you can sense it as a somewhat optimistic framing of the world, but I wanted to begin my talk by asking all of you, how many of you find it hard to be optimistic about the planet? You find it hard to listen to the news. You almost don't want to listen to the news at all because it's just full. So raise your hands, please, so I can get a sense. All right. So actually, there are a few non-raised hands I really admire, but I will raise my hand as well. And it has been challenging for many years for those of us who do this for a living, but you'll see how I came from this talk as sort of my journey from how I came from being completely overwhelmed with bad news to being more positive. So again, the title of the talk is Bright Spots, Making a Difference for Nature, Climate, and People. And I'm going to try to give some examples from all of those things. I'll have quite a few examples about the ocean, but not only about the ocean. And I actually post regularly on Blue Sky. I've given up on Twitter/X, but I do post on Blue Sky pretty regularly. And so if you want more examples, really pretty much every day that I'm not overwhelmed by something else, I post at least one example of something that's going right for the planet. So, but I have a confession to make, as I sort of alluded to just now. I haven't always been this great speaker about bright spots or optimism. And that's partly because of the way my career has unfolded. You see on the right-hand side is a picture of my first year in graduate school at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab in Jamaica when I was a budding coral reef scientist. And then on the other side, you see a picture of when I returned to Discovery Bay, Jamaica after a very long period, 50 years after I first went there. Remarkably, it's the same snorkel, but everything else is pretty much different. I've got bifocals in my mask, and more importantly, the reefs in Jamaica and actually around the world have really changed dramatically. In Jamaica, you can see here the amount of live coral on the reefs this is actually data for the entire Caribbean, has changed dramatically. As I said, I started my career in 1974, so these data begin in 1977, and it was still quite a lot of live coral back then across the Caribbean, and Jamaica, in fact, was covered with live coral when I first arrived. But over the years, as a function of a variety of different things that if you want to ask me about later, I'm happy to explain, the amount of live coral has gone down and down and down. So even by 2002, it was is dramatically decreased. And so I've had my career bookended essentially by this incredible decline in coral reefs, which has made which is perhaps not too surprising why it's been hard at times to be optimistic. In fact, my husband, Jeremy Jackson, who also works in a related field, for decades, we gave talks on the plight of the oceans, the plight of reefs. We were even called Drs. Doom and Gloom on the lecture circuit. So you can relax and enjoy the fact that I've turned a page. But it's not as if the news has been really great, even recently. And I want to acknowledge this at the beginning, and I'll also return to this at the very end. These are two very, very recent pieces that appeared. The one on the left is from Science magazine, a very distinguished magazine. And what it says is, after the mass coral die-off, Florida scientists rethink plan to save ailing reefs. There were all these restoration projects going on in the Florida Keys. And as a consequence of a massively hot water, in fact, I think the news said something like it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Florida. It's just almost, it's more than bathtub water, really. It's just amazingly hot. And as a result of that hot water, almost all the corals that were in these restoration projects died in Florida. And then on the right-hand side is an essay that was the beginning of an essay that was just published in 2026. And the title here is Coral Species from Another Ocean May Be the Only Way to Save Caribbean Reefs. And this is not some crank that's written this article. These are actually very, very distinguished coral reef scientists who wrote this essay suggesting that really there was no hope for the local native species, and then we had to bring in species from the Pacific Ocean in order to save reefs. And I say that not because I endorse that point of view. In fact, I don't endorse that, at least not right now. I don't endorse it. But it's a reflection of how desperate the situation has become on many Caribbean reefs. And so even in 2024, 25, 26, the news has been pretty bad. That said, at one point, probably about 2006 or 7, I was teaching students at the Scripps Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, Veronica told you about, briefly alluded to in the introduction. And I would my husband and I would give these lectures. It was a summer, sort of like summer boot camp for marine biologists. And we brought in economists and climate scientists and biological oceanographers and marine biologists and put them all together in a room for 9 weeks in the summer. And we would always begin these summer teaching exercises with sort of our review of the state of the ocean. So as you can imagine, it was not a very cheerful way to begin a course. And we did this year after year for a number of years. And then eventually I started thinking, here we created the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation. I used to call it the medical school for the ocean. But then I thought, wait, in medical school, they don't teach budding doctors to write obituaries of the patients. That's not what medical school for humans is about. And so if we're running medical school for the ocean, why are we training our students to write ever more refined obituaries of the ocean and the nature at large? And so it was kind of a light bulb moment for me. I realized, I can't just talk about all the problems. I really have to talk about the solutions. And there's actually very good social science that goes along with this that says that essentially if you give people the impression that there are huge problems, but moreover, the problems have no solutions, then it doesn't lead to any kind of action at all. It leads to apathy and withdrawal. I mean, people, honestly, they would rather, watch television, go to the bar, or whatever it is they do to sort of screen out the bad news. If they think if things are so bad and there's nothing they can do about it, there's really no point in trying to do anything or even caring about it. So with that, I sort of came to this independently, but as I say, there's all this social science research that when I finally saw the light, if you will, that supported the idea that we really had to spend some time talking about the solutions and the successes if we were ever going to make progress in the conservation front. And so for that reason, I started a series of symposia. That was the first thing I did, called Beyond the Obituaries. That was a reflection of this sense of medical school for the ocean, Beyond the Obituaries. Then a Twitter campaign with some colleagues of mine called #Ocean Optimism, which you can see an early post from that. And then when I moved to the Natural History Museum in Washington, I also took the ocean optimism idea and helped run a series of 2 major summits called the Earth Optimism Summits, where we brought people from around the world to talk about what was working just generally in conservation. So that's really how this journey kind of unfolded. So let me start this whole the details of what I'm going to talk to you about tonight with just a brief discussion of, what are bright spots and why are they important. So, and to do this, I'd like to pay homage to this guy named Max Roser. He's one of the founders of Our World in Data. I don't know how many of you know about Our World in Data. It's this amazing website. And I really and it gives you the latest, you'll see a number of charts in my talk from it. So it has data on all sorts of things. And many of the things are surprisingly optimistic. And one of the people that runs it now, in fact, is the author of several really positive books about climate, which I'll get to in a second. But in any case, Max Roser makes this point about the 3 truths that we have to hold in our brains simultaneously. And he uses as example medical information, but you could do the same thing with nature. So he says, well, he doesn't say, as I say, I'm paraphrasing this, but basically we focus on the woes of the present, which, is reflected, for example, in sort of this kind of addictive doom scrolling behavior that many of us, and I sometimes engage in it myself, I confess, do. And so in the context, say, of health, you could be totally focused on the fact that 4.4% of all children die before they reach adulthood. And that's a really depressing statistic. 4.4% is a lot of dead children around the world. But then in the process of focusing so hard on the number of dead children now, we lose track of the fact that historically things were much worse, and we've made a lot of progress, because historically 50% of all children used to die before they reached adulthood. So we've made an order of magnitude improvement in terms of child mortality from the historical past to the present. And then the final piece of this is that it's still, as I said, still a lot of children dying, but there are these bright spots where even fewer children are dying. And these provide not only inspiration, but actually really lessons for the future. So in the case of child mortality, in Europe, only 0.47% of all children die before they reach adulthood. So that gives us an idea of, yes, it was at 50%, now it's at 4.4% globally, but we could do much better. So a whole order of, right where we are now is an order of magnitude better, but there are places in the world where you see an order of magnitude improvement relative to the global average, and we should take those places as exemplars and lessons for how we can bring the whole world up to, say, the level of 0.4% children dying in adulthood. And it's really important. Not all these, the point he makes is that these three statements are all true. So it's not like one is true and it's not true. And you have to keep them all in your mind and in balance as you make your way through the news cycle or whatever it is you're trying to do. So this is kind of the framing I'd like you to sort of keep in mind, because what I'm going to do is focus on the bright spots which we have tended to ignore. And I'm going to do it in the context of three different spheres: the biosphere, which is species and natural habitats; the geosphere, which you can think of as the land, the water, the air, and particularly climate; and then the anthroposphere, which is, of course, human health and well-being. So I'll sort of try to give some examples from all of these places. In some cases, the bright spots I'll talk to you about touch on more than one. In fact, I'll close with a favorite that I just learned about, which is all three, and give you this is just a taste. As I say, I post for about 10 years, I've been posting every day, almost every day, about at least one bright spot, and often more than one bright spot. So there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of these examples. And what I'm trying to do is just give you a sense, a sort of a tasting menu, if you will, of some of the things that are going right on the planet, despite the overwhelming amount of bad news that we hear about the environment. So since I'm in Florida, I thought I'd begin with some Florida icons. This afternoon, I was walking around having conversations with people, and I saw right outside the door here both a snowy egret and a brown pelican. Now, you may not think that that's very remarkable, and in fact, they are super common now in Florida, and for that matter, not the pelicans, but the snowy egrets are common in Maine, where I live as well. But they weren't always common. And they've become so common, we've tended to forget why they're common now. Because the snowy egret in the 19th century and many other egrets were hunted to the brink of extinction for their feathers. Because women back then liked hats with these big feathers and nests and all. I mean, there was just practically had an entire zoo on the top of their heads. I'm not sure exactly why that fashion evolved, but it was. And it was so bad that feather hunters would go to nesting rookeries of these shorebirds and essentially tear the feathers out of the adult birds. Because they were nesting, they wouldn't leave their nests, so they were very vulnerable. Tear the feathers off the living birds, leave the baby birds to die, and do it over and over and over again until these birds literally were on the brink of extinction. And it wasn't until several women in England and two Boston socialites here in the United States said, enough is enough. We do not want to drive these birds to extinction for the purpose of decorating our hats. And so as a consequence, the Audubon Society was founded, and then legal actions were taken to protect the birds as well. And now they're super common. But it's really important they could have gone extinct if we hadn't acted to stop the feather trade back now over a century ago. I mean, similarly with brown pelicans, they're super common now, but they were also at the brink of extinction as a consequences of our use of DDT as a pesticide. As probably most of you know, DDT accumulates up the food chain, and so it becomes the higher predators in the food chain have more and more DDT in their bodies. And for birds, this is particularly problematic because it causes the eggshells to thin. So what happened when there was so much DDT being used, and there were even, I've found advertisements showing women spraying their kitchen cabinets with DDT, if you can imagine. So with a lot of DDT in the environment, and the brown pelicans nearly went extinct. In fact, the last time I was lecturing here at the University of Florida about 15 years ago, one of the faculty members, who's now Emerita, said to me, because I hadn't mentioned the brown pelican, she said, you know, the brown pelican, it was really bad. They said they would have gone extinct if we hadn't banned DDT, and that happened in 1972. And then finally, what I consider an incredible success story, and one that is very much a part of the Whitney story, because you have the Turtle Restoration Hospital here, I mean the Turtle sort of health clinic here, and plus a lot of research on the things that are killing turtles, particularly the viruses that are a real problem for the green turtle. So it's part of the Whitney Lab story, but it's really amazing, the recovery of green turtles as a function of all sorts of different efforts here and around the world to reduce people, well, first of all, stopping eating them, and then also protecting their nesting areas, and then using turtle excluders to reduce the bycatch in fisheries. So as a consequence, here you see this is the population of the Florida green turtles. And what you see is in 1979, there were 62 green turtle nests on the coast of Florida. And in 2015, there were 37,341 nests. Now, if you don't consider that a success, I'm not sure what I can do to convince you, but I think that I consider that an incredible success for Florida, and one that should be, as you are doing now, celebrated. So that's one example from Florida. And then there's also some other really interesting examples of the restoring of Florida habitats. And this is one that I am actually particularly fond of, because it was part of what made me realize that I had to actually do something about this. I couldn't just keep it in my head and with my students that there were success stories that no one was talking about, and that's the recovery of Tampa Bay. It's a complicated story, and I'll get back to some of the complications later, but in 2015, it was announced in the media that seagrass, having declined drastically, had recovered to 1950s level, thanks to the people of Tampa and a variety of sort of governmental and private organizations working together to clean up the water, and the seagrass returned to 1950s level. That also was an incredibly powerful success story. But what made it really resonate with me is that when I talked to my marine conservation colleagues, I said, have you heard about, because I read this in the newspaper like everyone else, and I said, have you heard about what's happened in Tampa? And most of my colleagues said, no, I never heard about anything in Tampa. And then the pièce de la résistance was, I came to a meeting in Tampa it was scientists all working on the Gulf of Mexico. They were all in Tampa in this one room, 200 people. And I stood up and I said, okay, so how many of you know about the recovery of seagrasses in Tampa, right outside your window here? And 200 people in the room, and 4 people raised their hand. I thought, oh my gosh, if the scientists are this ignorant, the general public, how could they possibly know about the importance of this? So that's what really catapulted me on this journey. Say, all right, I'm going to start talking about this a lot. And then briefly, I wanted to say something about coral reefs, because I said, I launched this discussion telling you how, in general, how dire the situation is for Caribbean reefs. But it's not all of the Caribbean. There's parts of the Caribbean where actually reefs remain in reasonably good shape. And one of those places is the island of Bonaire. And you see here on the left a picture of the reefs, which have lots of live coral, not too much seaweed, unlike many reefs where it's mostly seaweed and very little live coral. And you say, okay, how come the reefs of Bonaire are in such good shape? It's not an accident, just like banning DDT is not an accident. Stopping putting bird feathers in your hats is not an accident. So in this case, the Bonaire government took a lot of specific steps, and I'm not going to read them all, but say in the early 1970s, they banned spearfishing, they banned the harvest of live coral, and they set up a national marine park that went all the way around the island. And this continued, all these efforts continued until even 2010, where they banned the fishing of parrotfish and fish traps, both of which were very important because parrotfish eat seaweed, so they help keep the seaweed under control, and fish traps are terrible because they get lost, and then they just keep killing fish over and over again, and no one even gets to eat them, and so they're very detrimental to fish as well. So that's why the reefs of Bonaire are in such good shape, and they're not only in good shape like in this point in time, but they're very resilient. So I haven't bothered to show you all the graphs, but scientists who have studied it have shown not only is there a lot of coral and not much seaweed now, but when they had a big hurricane and there was a lot of coral death, the reefs recovered. And when they had other episodes of mass mortality, a bleaching event, the corals went down, but then recovered. So these reefs are not only healthy now, but they are resilient. And they're resilient because the people of Bonaire are taking care of them. Okay, so let's move a little bit farther afield. This is the story of the recovery of the California sea otter. Now, these were animals that really were on the brink of extinction. In fact, they were thought to be extinct, but it turned out that there were 50 of them on this little island, fairly remote. I mean, nowhere in California is really remote now, but back then there was a stretch, sort of central California coast, and this island where these sea otters were that no one knew about because no one ever went out to that island. So they were discovered, immediately protected, and as a result, they have slowly but steadily recovered their numbers so that they're now, instead of being on the brink of extinction, they're a tourist attraction in Central California, and they're also doing, this is a success story not just for the sea otters themselves, but for other parts of the ecosystem, and in particular, sea otters eat crabs, and the crabs destroy the salt marsh seagrasses. And so by having more sea otters in the ecosystem, they eat the crabs, and now you get a recovery also of the salt marshes as a function of the presence of the sea otters. And the sea otters are also very good for keeping kelp beds for similar reasons. They eat the things that eat kelp, and therefore we have many more kelp beds as a function of the sea otter recovery. So it's not just the sea otters that are benefiting, it's the whole ecosystem. This is another story. This one comes from close to where I live in Maine. It's the recovery of puffins. Now, in the beginning of the 20th century, there were essentially no puffins at all in Maine. And even though they were protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they still, by the, towards the end of the 20th century, there still were essentially no puffins in Maine. And this scientist, Stephen Kress, made it his life's work to essentially do something about the absence of puffins. And what he realized was that just protecting them from being hunted was not enough, and that puffins are sort of like people, and when people walk by a restaurant and there's nobody in the restaurant, you say, oh, it must not be a good restaurant, I'm not going to go in. Well, the puffins are the same way. They see a rock with no puffins, there must be something wrong with this rock. And so as a function of this realization, he put wooden puffins on the shore, and he played puffin calls, and then he translocated some baby puffins from another, in Canada where there were still some puffins, and put them there, and sure enough, they grew up, and then they went out and they came back and had babies, and now puffin viewing is a big industry on the coast of Maine because there are lots of puffins. Again, this is a complicated story. There are other things that have happened since, but basically this is a success for the restoration of the puffins. And it's not just puffins, because it turns out most social seabirds that nest in large colonies have the same kind of behavior. They're not comfortable unless they're in large groups. And so the methods that he developed has been used to restore seabird populations around the world. I want to turn now to some other things we've done to protect the ocean. And one of the most important things is the creation of marine protected areas. And I think it's really important to realize that marine protected areas aren't just big faraway places, but they can also be really close to home. So the one on the left is in Ross Sea, Antarctica. That's about as remote as you can get. But the one on the right, which was the image that was on the flyer for this talk, is from Mai Po Park in China, where I visited when I was a lecturer at Hong Kong University for a couple of years. They took me here, and it's amazing because here you've got this marsh, you've got seabirds, you've got actually endangered wading birds as well. and all sorts of things growing there. But it's between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, you've almost got 20 million people. So 20 million people, 60,000 birds, and a couple hundred different species of birds, all cohabiting successfully as a function of the establishment of this park. Here's an example of using marine protected areas to help fish reproduce. Turns out that some coral reef fish actually have a fantastical way of reproducing. They only reproduce 1 week a year, and they all, like for example on this island, which is where the study took place on Little Cayman Island, they all go to one place in Little Cayman Island around the full moon in January. And you can see them swimming here. It's just amazing aggregation. The problem, it's great, they all get together and have sex and make babies, so that's good. But the problem is that fishermen have known that there were a lot of, in this case, Nassau groupers there, and so they would come to the spawning aggregations, scoop up all the fish, literally by the basket practically, and it doesn't take too many years of doing this before you essentially destroyed the entire spawning aggregation, so nothing comes back to reproduce. And so as a function of having a variety of laws associated with the fishing of Nassau grouper and the protection of these spawning aggregations, you're starting to see now in Little Cayman Island the gradual rebuilding of these aggregations. And this is something that could be done in other places as well. These Nassau groupers, where it used to be, when I was a grad student, they were super common, and now in many places you never see them. So this is really a key step in having them return. And then in addition, in addition to protecting places, there's the whole issue of harvesting wisely, and how we harvest seafood. It makes a big difference in terms of its sustainability. And this is a really nice example from California, where we've seen the dramatic return of the large predators as a function of the banning of gill nets in 1994. And so you can see here the commercial catch from 1994 going up to 2009 for this particular chart, but also the recreational catch. I mean, the recreational catch is, I know, a big deal in Florida. You've got a lot of recreational fishers here. And so this kind of thing is, it's more than just commercial fisheries. It's also what people like to do on the weekend. And you can see this gentleman over here, obviously really being happy about the recovery of the fish. And what I learned today, this is why, as I say, I like to go to give talks. I learned today that the same thing happened in Florida, which I hadn't realized. Even though I make a point of trying to find out about bright spots and what's working, I hadn't realized about the bannings of gill nets in the coast of Florida. And as I understand it, the red drums have recovered in a similar way in Florida. I just learned this right before the talk, which is why I couldn't find any graphs to show it. But in any case, it's a Florida version of the same story, which is really, really good. So in addition to, I've been talking about recovering of habitats and recovering of individual species. There's also the recovery of what scientists call, kind of a dorky term, it's called ecosystem services. It means basically what nature does for us. And in the case of the recovery of seagrasses, it does a lot of things. First of all, it's habitat for things that we like to eat. And so what you see here is a story of the recovery of seagrasses, not in Tampa Bay this time, but in the bays off the coast of Virginia. And they planted scientists and volunteers got together and planted 70 million seeds of seagrasses, resulting in 9,000 new acres of seagrass, which is great for the seagrass. But in addition, you can see a big increase in the number of vertebrates and fish that are commercial importance. And in terms of that geosphere side of the equation, you can see that the seagrass sediments are now storing carbon and nitrogen. So for example, they're helping us with climate changes as well. So it's a big success on a variety of different levels. So I've been talking about various things you can do to protect or better manage different species or how to restore ecosystems. But it's also, sometimes we actually have to get rid of things. And in particular, we need to get rid of invasive species in some cases. And some of the best examples we have of getting rid of invasive species come from islands. And the reason is because if you get rid of something bad on an island, the island then is isolated and these bad things don't come back. And when I say bad things, I'm talking about rats, and then feral goats and pigs and things like that that really wreak havoc on the ecosystem, and in some cases, invasive plants. So here you see two examples, one from Palmyra Atoll, which is an island essentially in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, due south of Hawaii. I've been there, it's actually an amazing place. But the reefs around it were pretty pristine, but the landscape was dominated by palm trees, which is not ideal for example, these seabirds like this booby. And so the Nature Conservancy, I'm actually on the global board of the Nature Conservancy, and they do some amazing things around the world. They've been very active in not only getting rid of various invasive creatures, but getting rid of all the palm trees and replacing them with the native trees that the seabirds like to nest on. So you see, that's one example. And here in South Georgia, the island, which is near Antarctica, the island was infested with rats. And as a result, the rats were eating all the baby eggs and baby seabirds. They spent several years getting rid of all the rats. Now the rats are gone, and you've got this huge rebirth in seabird populations. Both of those major efforts, and these are not, they're one of literally scores of efforts to get rid of invasive species that have happened around the world as a result of the development of it's actually not that easy to get rid of rats on a big island like South Georgia, but scientists have worked very hard at figuring out how to do it without minimizing the damage to other parts of the ecosystem. And then here is another example, again, close to my home. This is a picture I took of about 15 minutes from where I live. And that has to do with getting rid of the obstacles in rivers that block the swimming of fish from the ocean to freshwater to spawn and then back. And so in this case on the left, the work was to remove sort of small, non-functional dams that were blocking the movement of fish. And it's had a huge impact just even locally, but more broadly in Maine, they've also removed really big dams. And the result has been this dramatic recovery in a variety of fish that swim between the ocean and inland and freshwater to breed, including the alewives, which are very important fish for bait for lobstermen, and as well they feed bald eagles and striped bass, all sorts of things. So they play a very central role in the ecosystem. You can see here how there were almost no alewives from 1993 until about 2008, but because they removed a big dam in 1999, another big one in 2008, since then the number of alewives have really skyrocketed, really transformed not only the river, but also the ocean life into which the river feeds. Some of the biggest examples of recovery of wildlife has actually occurred in Europe. So this is a chart, again, from Our World in Data. This is a sort of chart you can find, as I say, in that site. So this shows the percent recovery of all these different large animals in Europe. And the champion is the Eurasian beaver, which has increased by 16,705%. That's a fairly substantial increase. But a lot of other creatures, wild boar, red deer, gray wolf, all sorts of show fairly substantial increases. But the beaver is amazing. It's gone from 1,200 to 1.2 million. And there was a wonderful story that came out about a year or so ago about this Czech village that had spent 7 years trying to get the permits and the design for this dam project that they needed to build. And then one night, a family of beavers came in and built the dam for free. And so their problem was completely solved as a function of these enterprising beavers, and it saved them, as I say, $1.2 million. It was pretty amazing. So these things, there's not just the animals, it's also we humans that benefit from these recoveries. And then here's a really wonderful example from Africa. Gorongosa National Park is in Mozambique, and it used to be a beautiful wildlife area, but then it was it was sort of the epicenter of a civil war, and all the fighting parties basically ate everything, and the land was full of traps and mines and all sorts of terrible things. And a philanthropist named Gregory Carr decided to do something about it. It's really amazing. He signed a 20-year contract with the Mozambican government and to restore this ecosystem. And so as a result, there's been a 95% recovery of herbivores. The lions went from like 4 or 5 lions to hundreds of lions. And they've also managed to even successfully reintroduce wild dogs, which any of you who have ever gone on an African safari know they're very, very hard to spot almost anywhere in Africa, but here they occur. But it's not just the wildlife that he's cared about, and this is a message that's really important to emphasize. In the context of this park, the whole idea is that it can't be something with a fence around it with all the people that live in Africa can't get into and can't benefit from. And so he and his foundation have really worked extensively to make sure that people benefit from all this wildlife. Because there is a real thing of human-wildlife conflict, and so there has to be a benefit to have all, these lions running around in your backyard. And so he's built healthcare clinics. He's brought in a lot of agricultural resources to help them grow their crops more effectively, teacher training, and the establishment of preschools. And so this is a perfect example where the benefits to nature and the benefits of people are completely integrated in a way that makes the success of nature possible. Because if the people around the Gorongosa National Park did not want wild animals there, you could be sure they wouldn't be there. You have to have buy-in from local people, and this is a perfect example of that. Here's another example I really like about cleaning up beaches, and this was from a lawyer named Afroz Shah. He came and talked at the first Earth Optimism Summit. And he was a lawyer, he was well-to-do, he didn't need to spend his weekends cleaning up the really disgusting messes on the beach, which you can see over there on the left. But he talked about this at the summit. He said, I could have just written a letter to the government and complained, but I said to myself, if I don't care enough to do something about it, why should the government? And so he and his 80-year-old neighbor went out every weekend for several years, and as a result, they cleaned up with a lot of volunteers 22,000 tons of trash, and now there are turtles that actually nest on that beach. And he's gone on also to work on cleaning up rivers and other habitats. In terms of cleaning up things and reducing waste, there's a couple other examples I want to share with you. The one on the left has to do with South Korea and the way they manage food waste. Now, it turns out that we grow a lot of food on the planet, but a third of it we waste. It just goes bad, or it's thrown away. It's like you sits in the back of your refrigerator, or you don't finish your plate at a restaurant or whatever. So a huge amount of food gets wasted. And in most countries, it just goes into landfill. Nothing gets done with it. But in South Korea, the government has really made an investment in figuring out how to collect all this waste and turn it into either livestock feed, fertilizer, or fuel. And it's a big success story. And countries from around the world will go to South Korea to figure out how they do it. It's not cheap, but the benefits are really substantial. And then some countries, in terms of other kind of waste, plastic waste, remains, I would have to say that we are far from solving the problem of plastic waste on the planet. But there are, again, bright spots, which is, of course, the theme of this talk. And one of them is several countries in East Africa, including Tanzania, where they've essentially banned single-use plastics in almost all situations. In fact, I had to, before I went there, because of this warning when you apply for a visa, they no single-use plastic. I made sure my toiletries weren't in plastic, which of course is in violation of TSA. But anyway, so get rid of all the plastic and then go in, and you really notice it as you function in the environment. This is a picture taken of me at a tourist place, and I had a lunch, and my drink was served in a glass bottle, and my lunch came in a paper bag. And so there's almost no plastic waste on the roadside if you travel around places like Tanzania. Kenya is similar. This is a really serious problem. I'm sure you've all heard about these forever chemicals. And this is, again, is even really, I think, a worse problem in many ways than plastic waste per se. There are something like 15,000 of them, and we've got a lot of work to do. And in fact, when I gave this talk yesterday, somebody called in and Zoom and asked me about forever chemicals in solar panels and electric car batteries, which I went and read about today. And it's an area of, people are working on recycling and figuring out how to break them down. The problem is far from solved, is what I want to emphasize. But nevertheless, these data, which just got published a couple of weeks ago, show that if you look at the for pilot whales, either their liver or muscle, and analyze them for the presence of for these 4 forever chemicals, what you see, depending on the age in which the sample was taken from 1990 and then to 2025, is for 3 of the 4 chemicals which have been discontinued, you can actually see now, starting to see a decline in the amount of those chemicals in the liver and the muscle of these whales. So it does show that you can actually slowly but surely get rid of them if you stop using them. As I say, it's a problem that's far from solved, but I thought this was a really, small bright spot, but an important one to mention. Now this is a big bright spot. It's the size of all of Antarctica, and it's the reduction, it's a regrowth of the getting rid of the ozone hole as a function of the banning of chlorofluorocarbon chemicals, which we used to use in refrigerants and a lot of other things as well. Now, it started with science in the 1970s and 1980s. Scientists first discovered that these chemicals destroyed ozone, and then later scientists were able to detect that actually the ozone hole was, there was a big hole in the ozone layer. Ozone layer protects us from UV radiation, so you don't want a hole in the ozone layer because then you're exposed to a lot of dangerous radiation. So as a function of the uproar that came about from the particularly discovery that there was actually a hole in the ozone layer, and it could be visualized sort of like you see here, it led to a lot of international diplomatic activity, which culminated in the signing in 1987 of the Montreal Protocol, which I would argue is the most successful global treaty we have ever been able to pass and execute. It's got a lot of features that make it particularly successful. They allowed countries to join over time. They modified it as it went along, so there's a kind of flexibility to it. But in any case, it's been super successful. So you can see the decline in the emissions of these chemicals, and on the big chart, and then on the inset on the right, you can see the decline in the size of the hole in the ozone layer as a result of this treaty and this international cooperation. And scientists have estimated that as a result of the Montreal Protocol and the reduction in these in the production of these chemicals, 2 million cases of skin cancer will have been prevented by 2030. Here's a related, it's a different kind of air pollution, but the air pollution that we actually can sense with our own eyes and noses, and that's the air pollution of particulate matter in major cities around the world. When I was a grad student in Berkeley, I would go and visit friends in LA, and it was so bad that you could actually not see the distance from this podium to the end of the room. It was that, and your eyes, you'd walk outside, and within about 30 seconds, your eyes would burn. And that was true for many, many cities. And what there has been is an incredible reduction in air pollution over time. And on the left, you see it for London, starting from the earliest date is 1700. So it increased with the rise of industrialization. But then once steps were taken to start working on reducing it, by 2016, you can see it's a tiny fraction of what it used to be. And then here's Paris. This is much more recent as a function of particularly the mayor of Paris, who's been very pro-environment on a variety of different fronts, including air pollution and getting rid of cars in the city, and having, now when you go to Paris, streets that used to be just chock-a-block with traffic are now just chock-a-block with bicycles. That's really an amazing transformation, and you can see it in the air. So in this particular graph, orange is bad and chartreuse is okay and green is good. So from 2007 to 2023, there's been a dramatic reduction in the amount of air pollution in Paris. And as I said, you can sense it when you go. So this last set of things I want to talk about are the advances we're making in terms of being able to deal with the climate change problem. And in particular, I want to talk about solar power and electric vehicles. So here on the left-hand side is a really interesting plot from The Economist, which I want to walk you through. So the black dots are the number of actual installations of solar power from 2000 to early 2020s. 2025, I get close to 2025. So that's what we've done. The yellow dots connect each black dot to 2030, and that is what the experts at the time thought where we would be at 2030. So for example, in 2015, we had about this much installation, but the projection of experts was that it wasn't going to be any more in 2030. And so what you can see is consistently, time after time after time after time after time, even as recently as about 2023, where we are versus where it was predicted is drastically different. So solar power is expanding at a pace that even the experts in solar power have been unable to really adequately predict the success of this technology. And the reason for this success, of course, is the fact that it's now much cheaper. So on the right, what you see is the price of various kinds of sources of power. And particularly the solar power you see in yellow goes from, used to be the most expensive form of power, and it's now the cheapest form of power, which is why around the world, we're seeing situations where, for example, in developing countries which have energy poverty, those countries are basically skipping the fossil fuel age by and large and moving directly to renewable energy, which is a very good thing. And then here's the example for electric vehicles. This is just Europe. And I want to focus on Europe because now, of course, China is really poised to completely transform electric vehicles globally. But in many ways, what China did is a little bit harder to, because they had a very powerful economy and a very powerful central government, they were able to essentially say, we are going to invest in electric vehicles and this is what we're going to do. But in many democracies, that kind of strategy isn't really available. So this is Norway, which is a democracy like ours. And look at this. That's the top country, the top line. Now, as of 2025, 95.9% of all new cars in Norway are electric. It's amazing when you think about it. Now, how did they do that? They did that by reducing the taxes on electric vehicles. They cut the fares on, tolls on roads and fares on ferries. They actually paid people to turn in their gas engines. And the result has been a remarkable uptake. And this has been so successful in Norway, it's no longer necessary, but there are many countries where this kind of approach can be much more used than it is currently. All right, I want to finally conclude with a few examples of how I've alluded to examples of how people could benefit from these actions, but I want to give a few specific examples. One is from Cabo Pulmo in Mexico. It's a small fishing village. They had been consistently overfishing really for decades, and the senior member of the family, it was almost like an extended family, this village, he said, this cannot continue. We're fishing more and more, harder and harder, and getting less and less to eat. And so he brought in university scientists. They created a protected area in front of the village, and the result has been a dramatic increase in the amount of fish in Cabo Pulmo National Park, which is, these are comparisons 1999 to 2009 in places that weren't protected or places that were protected by ineffective government actions. On the right, 1999 to 2009, you can see this huge explosion, which you see here as well. And of course, the fish are benefiting, but the people of Cabo Pulmo are benefiting as well. It's resulted in a big increase in their incomes. And now if you Google Cabo Pulmo, you'll see this huge amount of advertisement for dive sites because people come from around the world to dive in a place where they can swim in the middle of schools of fish. It's not just small villages. This is an example from the Northwest Hawaiian Islands where marine protected areas were established. And there was a lot of opposition to these marine protected areas because the fishermen said it would decrease their ability to earn a living from fishing. The result, in fact, has been exactly the opposite. So as a result of closing off some areas for fishing, what happens is fish grow up inside, the females get really big, big females produce lots of eggs and lots of baby fish, and those fish then swim out of the marine protected areas so that they can be caught by commercial fishers. And so what you see is that the catch per unit effort, which is how much fish you get per, say, day of fishing, has increased by 54% for yellowfin tuna and 12% for big-eye tuna. So it's actually been a fisheries success story as well as protecting the environment. And then finally, a really wonderful example from Indonesia of a woman named Kanuri Webb who went to Indonesia trying to figure out how to reduce deforestation because she was really concerned about the fate of orangutans and having all the forests cut down. And so she went there, and then she got there and she realized she didn't really understand what was going on. And so she spent what she calls 2 years of what she calls radical listening, which was essentially going family by family, house by house, and asking them, Why are you cutting down trees? And it turns out that people didn't really want to cut down trees. They had to cut down trees to pay for the doctor's bills for their kids. So instead of sort of banning deforestation or trying to get people to, sort of as a second order effect to stop cutting down trees, she brought in medical care, she brought in doctors from medical schools around the world. She also gave them instruction in terms of alternative income so they could make money from organic agriculture instead of cutting down trees. And the result has been a 70% decline in deforestation, a 90% decline in the number of families that depend on logging for their incomes, and importantly, a 67% decline in infant mortality. So this is a really beautiful example of how nature and people, when they live in harmony, that both nature and people benefit. And then finally, I'd like to close with a really nice example that I learned about when I was in Gainesville, which is this place called the Sweetwater Wetlands Park. I don't know, how many of you have been there? Yay, okay, so you know what I'm talking about. I saw more birds in 2 hours there than I've seen in a whole year in Maine, so it was really exciting, including the sandhill cranes. When I asked people about it, the story just was actually even more interesting than I realized, because of course the birds are doing well, the grasses are doing well, but this park was not created just to have a nice place for birds. It was actually created as an alternative to a water treatment facility. And there was, again, initial skepticism that this was a good idea, but in fact, the tides turned in terms of public opinion when they realized this was a lot cheaper than building a big sewage treatment plant. And so as a function, it actually not only is beautiful for wildlife, but it also cleans the water and benefits people by cleaning the water directly, and also by sequestering carbon, and also by cleaning their water more cheaply than it would be possible if they had built a sort of standard treatment plant. So it's a biosphere success story, it's a geosphere success story, and it's an anthropocene success story. So I hope I've given you kind of this whirlwind tour of some of the successes that I've encountered over the course of 15 years of collecting them. But I want to convey that this is not just me out there. There are a lot of other people who have really contributing to this, what I call a sort of a new conservation narrative, one that's focused much less on documenting the problems and much more on finding and celebrating the solutions. These are a couple of the books, but there are more books coming out every year that reflect this new sort of approach within the conservation community. And so I want to, at the very end, I want to touch just a little bit on why I've told you, I wanted to give you a sense of how many different successes there were, and on all sorts of scales, from the very local to the very global. But I want to now, part of this new conservation narrative has sort of changed the way scientists think about conservation success, and in particular, in addition to learning, sort of the details of what the success was, they want to know, okay, what enabled the success? Why did these success happen? And four of the things that I think are really important to emphasize are visionary leadership, and by visionary I mean people able to envision a better future, good governance and financial support, science and technology, and actually, importantly, nature itself. So in terms of visionary leadership, here are just three examples: Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, the Castro family, and the creation of the Cabo Pulmo National Park. And I haven't mentioned her by name, but Anne Hidalgo, who is a mayor of Paris, has done all this transformational change over the last decade. In terms of governance, a couple of the examples I mentioned: fisheries, the fisheries policy of the government of Bonaire, the Tampa Bay seagrass recovery, which was driven by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, a very local, so this is governance, sort of community governance, which has really been essential for making this happen in Tampa Bay. And then in Norway, the government policies for electric vehicles. In terms of science and technology, we have the example of Steve Kress and his discovery of how to make seabird restoration a success. We have the amazing science done by atmospheric scientists that discovered the mechanism and the existence of the ozone hole, and used that to create public awareness, which drove the international action and the Montreal Treaty. And then finally, solar panels and electric vehicles, where the science and technology of how to create solar power cheaply, how to create batteries that could drive a car for longer than, say, to your supermarket, it had been really critical in terms of driving this transition of electrification forward. This actually happens to be my house and my electric vehicle, but there's, of course, a lot more than that in the world, thankfully. And then finally, nature itself. I mentioned the great beavers of Europe, who once people stopped killing them, they rebounded spectacularly. The ability of seabirds to recover once you got rid of rats on islands, and then the recovery of the alewives when you take down the dam. So it's amazing. It doesn't always happen. There are examples where things have not recovered in the way we expected. Perhaps cod. In the cod fishery is perhaps one of the biggest examples of something where we stop fishing and they still haven't really come back. So it's not universal, but it is amazing how resilient nature is and how things can recover when you stop killing them. And so if you're tired of planetary doom scrolling, I've put a few things up here that you might want to follow up on. So at the library, a bunch of different books by Yana Johnson, Catherine Hayhoe, who's a really interesting climate scientist, evangelical Christian, so she does a lot of work of communicating science and climate change. And if you want to know how to talk to somebody who doesn't believe in climate change, I really recommend her book because she has some very good strategies. And then, as I say, Wild Hope. Hannah Ritchie is now in charge of big parts of Our World in Data website, and she's written 2 books, It's Not Too Late in Clearing the Air. Paul Hawken, Drawdown and Regeneration, about the best methods for dealing with climate change. And there, as I say, there are tons of others. And then on the web, there are all sorts of sites. Fix the News, Reasons to be Cheerful, the Weekly Anthropocene, the Progress Playbook, Solutions Journalism. And one I really like is this New York Times series. They did 50 states, 50 fixes. Because right now in the United States, it's no secret that protecting the environment is really not the top priority of the government at the moment. But nevertheless, there is a lot of positive stuff happening in the United States, and I encourage you to read about what's going on in every state. It's just one example per state, but it gives you a sense that this is happening even in places where the political climate is not necessarily conducive to protecting nature. So, finally, to close, I'm not saying to ignore the bad news and the setbacks and the trade-offs. For example, the forever chemicals in solar panels, or the mining for material, minerals for batteries. Those are all real, as are the horrifying projections of where we may be heading. So please don't get me wrong, I'm not a Pollyanna with rose-colored glasses. Those things are real. And in fact, when I came to Florida 2 years ago, these were the 2 headlines that I found right before I came to give a talk at the University of Miami. One on the collapse of seagrasses in Tampa Bay, and one on how manatees, having been delisted from the endangered species list, were suddenly dying in droves. Now, I'm happy to report that I talked to a student in Gainesville, and apparently the Tampa Bay seagrasses are now on the recovery. As I learned yesterday, also are the seagrasses here in the Indian River Lagoon, which is also really good news, and part of the studies that are being done here. And the manatees no longer seem to be dying in droves. I don't think you have to feed them lettuce anymore, which is what was happening for a while. So there are big problems, and there's just a huge amount of work that still needs to be done. And so to give you a feeling for that, this is a paper that I was involved with that was published a couple of years ago. And all you need to do is look at this. Red is bad, blue is good, and beige is neutral. So on the left are the fish stocks, and what you can see is, there's some big chunks of blue, but there are also big chunks of red, and some things which aren't really doing much of anything. This is marine mammals on the right, actually quite a bit more blue, but still some red, and still some places where nothing much is happening. So that's kind of a visualization. We've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot more still to be done. Similarly, for protection and restoration, these are the percentage of percentage of the ocean covered by marine protected areas on the left. You can see it's climbed, but it's still only under 8%. So it's not anywhere near enough. And similarly, these are the number of restoration projects, upwards of almost 2,000 in a number of cases. That's a lot, but they tend to be small, so it still doesn't come close to rebuilding everything we've lost. So we still have a lot to do. So I guess I'd like to close with the message that really everyone can make a difference. all of you can make a difference by simply the way you think about the environment, the way you talk to your friends and neighbors, and anything you want to do in the way of civic responsibility that contributes to the benefit of the nature. I really like this example, which I learned about yesterday, of the Indian River Lagoon Billion Clam Initiative, which is housed and sponsored here at the Whitney Lab, but is also was founded, as I understand it, by a local person very active in the local fishing community. And it's a wonderful example of a partnership between scientists and communities to get the Indian River Lagoon into a healthy place. And I really commend you, all of you, for supporting this kind of activity, and that, you know, anything more you can do for this and other projects at the Whitney will be a definite plus. And so here are some final words to remember. The first comes from Voltaire, so that's a couple hundred years ago. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's really important to remember that nothing is perfect, really. Nothing is perfect. And if all you do is look for perfection and then sort of tear down anything that's not perfect, you're really not helping the cause. The second is a quote from Bill Gates, which I think is really important. It says, "We overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. So we tend to get really frustrated when things don't go well right away. You know, we do something, why isn't it better right now? But if you wait long enough, things can sometimes get much, much better than you ever anticipated, including, for example, the expansion of solar power that was totally underestimated by the experts in the area." Then a favorite of mine, the African proverb, which is, if you think you are too small to make a difference, you haven't spent the night with a mosquito. Now, in Maine, they call the mosquito the state bird, but I have a feeling that in Florida, it's probably up there pretty high as well on the Indian River Lagoon. And so I'm sure there are a lot of mosquitoes in this room that are pushing in various ways to make a difference. And if you just keep pushing, the difference actually happens. And then finally, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, so one of my favorite singers is Joan Baez, and her quote is, "Action is the antidote to despair." So that'll say thank you, and happy to entertain questions.